Let's try now to understand the basics of neuron functions. And the most important feature of neurons is their ability to induce or initiate an action potential. And action potential, actually, we can say these are electrical signals or impulses. They are like electrical current running through the neurons. And action potentials are the primary means of communication through the nervous system. And in fact, neurons have these currents even when they are not transmitting any signal. Okay, so there is, even when they are at rest, they have this current, and that is called the resting potential. So the resting potential is the current running through the neurons or within the neurons, let's say within the neurons, when they are not working, when they are not transmitting a signal. To understand this, we need to remember that neurons likes to separate the sodium and potassium. Let's move to here. Okay, for the cells, this is the, let's say this is the plasma membrane. So this is outside, this is inside. For the neuron, it likes to keep sodium ions outside and keeps potassium ions inside. So this is the distribution they would like. So there will be like a separation between these two ions, and this will generate this separation will generate the resting potential. Okay, now this does not mean an absolute separation. There are sometimes sodium ions inside and there are potassium ions outside. Let's go back to here. Now, since we have the majority of sodiums are outside, the majority of the potassium are inside, this is generating concentration gradients for both of them. So there is a concentration gradient of potassium, toward outside. There is concentration gradient for sodium toward inside. So there are some leakage of sodium toward inside, there is some leakage of potassium toward outside. But as we said, the neuron would try to keep the sodium outside and the potassium outside. So to counteract this movement of sodium and potassium, it has this pump, the sodium-potassium pump. So every time this pump runs, it brings in two potassiums. So it brings in two potassiums from outside and takes out three sodiums from inside. So it brings in two potassium, takes out a three sodium every run or every cycle. 2 in potassium, 3 out of sodium. And that is how it maintains this separation of potassium and sodium outside and inside. Now, the resting potential is the difference in voltage across the cell membrane when the cell is at rest. When the cell at rest. So when there is no signal running, we would measure, or the scientists measure, the differences of voltage between inside and outside. And they found that inside is always negative, outside is always positive when the cell at rest. So they called this the resting potential. The resting potential. And that resting potential is minus 70 millivolt. Minus, it means that inside is negative comparing to outside. Now, sometimes, and although the pump works hardly to maintain the sodium ions outside and the potassium ions inside, some of these ions, we said, might escape. Oops. Some of these ions might escape to the opposite direction or to the opposite end. And this will cause changes in the resting potential. And these changes are called degraded potentials. These are small changes as a result of ions escaping to the other side. As a result of ions escaping to the other side. Now, these ions actually might lead to either one of two situations. Now, let's go back to here. We said the resting potential is minus 70 millivolt. And that is a result of the separation of sodium and potassium. So let's say we need like 5 potassium outside, 5 potassium inside, 4 sodiums outside. Now, if there is an escape of these ions, either in one direction, what are the choices for this minus 70? Either it will decrease or it will increase, right? Now, at resting potential, we would say the membrane is polarized. Actually, let me withdraw this, erase this, and write it. At resting potential, the membrane is polarized. If you remember, it's exactly like the battery. So here it's positive, here is negative. It's exactly like the battery. It has 2 poles. This is at rest. Now, if we change the resting potential as a result of the movement of these ions, we have then either one of two situations. We have either decrease of the membrane potential or increase. Now, decrease, it means the value would move toward positive value, that is towards 0. Okay, whereas increase, it means it will move away from 0. So it might turn into minus 90 or something. So when we decrease the membrane potential, that is called depolarization. Whereas when we increase the membrane potential or the resting potential, that is hyperpolarization. Depolarization, it means we are losing the resting potential. Hyperpolarization, we are enhancing the resting potential. So these are results, both are results of graded potentials. Think of the graded potentials, when you try to start your car, you will put the key and you will turn it on. There will be like a wave or a series of sounds before the engine starts. Think of these sounds are the graded potential. What the engine is trying to do is or the car is trying to initiate the engine, but there is no fuel enough within the engine to start the process. So that is these small sounds. But when there is enough fuel, the engine would start. So these sounds are the graded potential. But when the engine is starting, it means there is enough fuel, or in our example, there is enough change in the resting potential that would lead to the action potential, which is the electrical signal. And that is only happening, action potential is a result of depolarization only. So only depolarization, I'll write it in a different color, only depolarization will lead to action potential. Only depolarization will lead to action potential. You might ask me, what about hyperpolarization? I will return this question to you, and I need you to think and post into the forum what will happen, or what hyperpolarization would lead to. What hyperpolarization would lead to. So I'm telling you, depolarization would lead to an action potential, and now you need to tell me what hyperpolarization would lead to. Now remember, depolarization would lead to the action potential, and that is the electrical signal. If you remember the example of the wound in the skin, that is when you are going to feel the pain. Okay? If someone is poking you with a small pen, very gently, you won't feel any pain, but if the poke was a little bit strong, you will feel the pain. That is the action. That is when a sensory neuron in your skin released an action potential and transmitted the signal to the spinal cord. Let's go back to here. So, as we talked about the engine, these little sounds in our human biology, we will call them summation. So these are graded potentials, can add up in space or time, and they would reach a trigger point. That's what we called enough change, or the changes are enough to induce the action potential. So that is the trigger point, and that would lead to the action potential. So let's recap. This is the resting potential. This is the depolarization, graded potential. This is the hyperpolarization, graded potential. This is the summation, like two stimulation. And here there is another summation, three stimulation. It reached this threshold or the triggering point, and that led to an action potential, which the signal is initiated and transmitted now. So again, I will stop here. Please go over what we talked about, post into the forum, and let me know if you have any question. Post your questions there. Try to answer your classmates' question. I will stop here, and then when we come back, we will try to understand the components of the action potential. See you in a bit.